Computer's idea of Hungarian. So thank you very much. Thanks to Milena and the whole team. It's been really fun so far. I'm going to be talking about, the title is Technologies of Empathy, and this is a set of work that I've been doing at the Media Lab at MIT for about a decade or so. So this is kind of a retrospective of a bunch of work done by myself and some of my students. We really run on a kind of an engineering model, but we try to bring some of the ideas and understanding that artists have of the world towards developing new technologies. This is, of course, the MIT campus. This is the Media Lab building itself, and this is what my team looked like around 2006. And we start with the premise that in fact, technology is a fairly complicated thing. But as Bruno Latour once said, technology is society made durable. That is, technology is made by certain people within society, and after they make the technology represents their interests. And Latour gives this great example of these devices. I don't even know the word in English, so I wouldn't know what it was in Serbian, but these are those things that close the door automatically. And the example that Latour gives, more or less, is that you live in a big office like this, maybe it's an architect's office, open plan, and the front door is over here, and people keep leaving the door open, which in the summertime means that you're very hot sitting at your desk over here. So you do what everyone does, which is you try to be civil-minded, and you just put a sign up on the door, and the sign says, "Please close the door after you enter, because I'm hot." And then, of course, people do whenever they see a sign, they just don't do it, right? So people leave the door open all the time. So you convince your boss, "I'd like to put one of these door closers on so that the door closes automatically." And the boss says, "Well, that's pretty expensive. I don't think we can do it." So eventually you're sweating, you're going through laptop keyboards because they're filled with salt. And finally your boss says, "Okay, I'll put one of those on the door," and so he gets some money, and he gets like the guy to come and screw it onto the door, and now the door closes and you're very, very happy. But the person who was over here was right next to the air conditioner, and they loved it when the door was open because the air conditioner is always blowing on them and they're cold all the time. And so this is like a little, micropolitics, that one person who had money and resources was able to produce technologies that made the world a little bit easier for them, but it, at the same time, made the world a little bit harder for someone else. So that leads to our first maxim, in my research group, which is that all technology is politics, basically. That essentially, technology is politics exercised by different means. And here's a nice example of a project that a student who was thinking about these issues did, named Lamore Freed. And so she was looking at how technology is often empowering the individual at the expense of people around them. So, during a lecture, people are on their phone. They'll do things rudely to help themselves, but it disempowers people around them. So she built this little piece of jewelry that you can put on in the morning. And if someone's being rude on the phone, you just press the button, and it disconnects any cell phone within about 3 or 4 meters. And this is, of course, illegal to sell in the United States. But she open sourced the plan and puts it online so you could rebuild it if you have the right equipment. Yeah, there it goes. So Lamore, she graduated, and this is the last copy of Wired, so she's doing very, very well. But overall, I felt that this project was kind of a failure because, in fact, what she did is just what she was criticizing, which is that if the technology is typically made to empower individuals, she was just kind of upping the arms race. And in fact, most of what we try to do looks a little bit different. But it does lead to the next principle that we made. There's Khrushchev and Nixon, quite a pair. The technology is also it's political, but it's not just geopolitical, it's also personal political. And these two dynamics go back and forth in interesting ways. So this, of course, was a famous interaction between Nixon and Khrushchev around the American kitchen, which was this highly automated. It was going to free women, and it was clean and spotless and hygienic. And in contrast, Soviet kitchens were dark and women worked too hard. And so Nixon was making the argument, "Oh, look at our kitchen. It gives people leisure time, and it's elegant and it's mechanical." But of course, these kitchens were designed entirely by men. Professional engineering is still an almost entirely male business in most Western countries. The US, I think, less than 7% of women in computer science and even less in electrical or mechanical engineering. Whereas actually the Soviet Union was doing a little bit better. And so that leads to, some other work. This is the work of Kelly Dobson, who is standing there with the former president of Iran, showing him a blender that she made. And she basically built this blender saying, well, in the 1960s, there were a variety of feminist artists who deconstructed kind of women's roles, and they would, for instance, out the gender identification of women with the kitchen and say women can do more than that. And so she started thinking, what if I could make a feminist blender? And so this is what it looked like. Could you turn the volume up a little for these? Thanks. If you're doing something with audio, blenders are very difficult because they're incredibly loud. So it looks very simple, but it actually uses machine learning, digital signal processing. It's got a very high-powered DSP built inside of it. And it has to do signal processing to cancel the noise. And moreover, she taught the system to only recognize that kind of sound of frustration, like a sound. So if you go la la la, it doesn't do anything. You have to just channel, thousands of years of being oppressed and not paid for your domestic labor. So the personal political often interacts with the geopolitical in interesting ways. So this is a student of mine named Aya Badir, who's from Beirut, and she was a student at MIT, and she's actually also a Canadian citizen as well as a Lebanese citizen. But every time she flew from Lebanon to Boston, she would get searched sometimes as many as 5 times in a single trip from Boston from Beirut to Boston, randomly, of course. And as a Middle Eastern woman, she was, she felt some of the searches were appropriate, some of them were inappropriate, but she had no recourse. And finally, she arrived in Boston one time, and the head of the immigration service started interviewing her, and it was a long, long interview, went on for over an hour, and he kept asking her these kind of very personal questions, and she thought, well, this is strange, it must be like, psychological operations or something. And finally, at the end, he slid his pad over to her, his pencil and pad, and said, that I can deport you in a minute if I think you're a threat to the United States. And she said, yes, I understand, that's your prerogative. And he said, you're so interesting, I'd love to take you out to dinner. And so she had to think in this kind of, quick, thinking, do I give him my number or not? And she figured, well, he can probably get my number anyway. So she did, thinking that this was all part of the test, but in fact, he called her every night for the next week. And so she, again, had no recourse at that point to the United States as a Middle Eastern woman. And so she started thinking through this kind of process, and she started engineering a system which was basically an undergarment that uses a very special type of new plastic. It's called quantum tunneling composite, and it can detect pressure by conducting electricity. And so she was able to use this plastic and very thin stainless steel wire, a watch battery, and a small microcontroller, a tiny computer, to build a suit that could detect how she was being touched 300 times a second with micrograms of resolution. And so it can pass through any contemporary metal detector undetected, and she can basically be building a record of how her body is being manipulated and touched in this kind of difficult political zone of airports. So, of course, when you go to the airport, there's all sorts of technology out there, but the technology isn't really helping you as a traveler most of the time. It's helping these very powerful organizations. And, I guess that's the real thing that we've learned over the last 10 years is that The politics of most technologies are very regressive. They're very conservative because they are developed primarily by corporations and by governments. And if you want to say change, it usually isn't said by the richest people for whom the world is already doing very well. And in fact, the philosopher of technology, Langdon Winner, said this very well. He said, he urges a lot of thoughtful caution, for instance, about nuclear power. He was doing this in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of people said, you're a Luddite, you don't like technology. And because you don't like technology, you're damning us to not changing, to not improving things. And he said, but it's really almost the opposite. If you want to perpetuate the status quo, you continue to allow those big corporations and those big governments who are already making things to keep making what they're making already. And so I think this is kind of important, and until now, I'll get to this in a minute, there hasn't been a really clear model of how to do that. And my own institution, MIT, is famous because it was actually the first university in the US to realize that all technology development in the US was going to be military-based. So something like 80% of MIT's money comes from the US government, and 80% of that money or so comes from the military. So MIT, people think, oh, it's so cool, they do all these great things. But in fact, it's a pretty huge defense contractor. It's number 50 with companies like Halliburton and Raytheon and all those really great companies that make the world so much better. So really MIT is part of this bigger team. Fuck yeah. So one of the things we've been doing at MIT is kind of trying to investigate and challenge the covert politics. And it's very funny because very quickly we became known by the campus administrators who didn't really like us much as the political group. But in fact, all the politics was happening. If you're funded 80% by the US government, you are very political. And while we were doing this work, the idea of what the US was doing was changing. We had an administration that was very, very difficult to understand, partly because they weren't giving anyone any information, but also because politically they represented everything we didn't like. And we started thinking, if we're now in a country where the government is torturing people, how do we solve that? What do we do? And we started looking at the work of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was an important Enlightenment thinker, and he, when times are dark, it's good when people are passing you torches out of their coffin. His writing continues to shine a really good light on this, and he talked specifically about this question of property and what made civilization work, what made people able to live together. And his main argument that it was empathy, that empathy is what allowed us to live together, and it's the most basic human emotion, even more so than safety or trying to stay warm or things like that. His argument is that the first person who fenced a piece of land and said, "This is mine," created all the ills that we know now. And that kind of idea of property ownership is the basis of civil society, but it's also the basis of all the problems with civil society. But one of the things about Rousseau and empathy that people don't know if they know his philosophy is that he was also a novelist. And he wrote one of the most important novels of his time, a novel called Julie. And what was great about Julie was that it portrayed the life of a servant girl. And apparently people, when they read this, they had never read a portrayal of someone's life from a different class in the way that Rousseau was able to do it. People apparently screamed out in public cafes as they were reading, in shame for the way that servants were treated. And some historians, like Lynn Hunt in the US, believes that it was epistolary novels and other things like that ended torture in Europe because people could suddenly understand other people's emotions and feelings much better than they could have otherwise. So Rousseau, I mean, he just offered so much and gives so many smart pathways to designing better technologies. And he looked really good too. I mean, he's
slowly. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back to your man. Now back to me.
So we started taking those two kind of principles, one of empathy and the other of the kind of enlightenment. I mean, Rousseau was on the run most of his life from governments. And so we decided to emulate some of that technique to basically do enlightenment approaches towards government and transparency, and also to talk about empathy. So I'll show you a couple of examples of the transparency ones first. This was really at the darkest moment of the Bush administration, 2002 and 2003, we were looking at a really big gap between what the government could learn about citizens and what citizens could learn about the government. And that gap was getting wider because the government was holding back information about what it did and keeping deals secret and things like this. That they were also spying on people's library records and all sorts of other information. And this was really typified in technology with this one project called Total Information Awareness. And TIA was a $500 million a year program to spy on everyone in the world all the time. And this was their actual logo, taken from their website. It's terrifying, right? It's like the dollar, shining in X-ray, and this was also from the website. So you're going through your daily life, you're jogging, not caring, and in the meantime, all this information is being scraped from your public and electronic records, and it's put into this coffee can, and then that generates a TQ or terror quotient. How likely are you to be a terrorist? And this is all from their website. So we used some of the people who were doing this research, and we got them drunk, and they gave us a lot of value, and they kept changing their logo because the first one was so bad. And my student proposed this as his master's thesis project, which was, if the government can take our information without our permission, can we take the government's information without its permission? And so we looked at Amazon, eBay. This is 2003, it's before the word Web 2.0 existed. But the first thing he did, he realized that you have to build a lot of good data for people to want to go to the site and leave their information. The idea being that everyone knows, every politician has a pharmacist or a taxi driver or a prostitute, and if those people would put information up, then you would know a lot about more of what's going on. But to get people to come to the site, you needed to give them good information. So he started by having a machine watch our government channels, this 24-hour government called C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN 2, and he had to build a machine because they're too boring for human beings to watch. And he quickly built a database of thousands, over 10,000 politicians, and you could figure out who gave them money, what fraternity they went to, all sorts of information, and very quickly start building conspiracy theories, which somehow always led to the Albanians. I don't know why. But I guess I touched a nerve. So we launched it on July 3rd, 2004, which is kind of our Independence Day, and immediately it became hugely popular. And I'll just show a video because the important thing about this work, it's not just that we're building working technology, but we're also engaging in politics by building the technology and doing that in public. And so this was my student kind of talking and defending the system from a lot of people who thought that it was too intrusive for the government. So.
In the post-9/11 world, the U.S. government has more power to monitor the activity of Americans, but now citizens may have a monitoring service of their own. Ryan McKinley, a graduate student at MIT, has created an internet database that may help consumers keep tabs on government activity. He's our Maverick of the morning. Ryan, it's good to talk to you.
Good to see you.
What exactly have you set up here?
Well, it's a system that has sort of two key parts. I've written a lot of parsers that get existing sources, so lots of public documentation, and then I'm working on ways for citizens to add more information to that, so that we can really harness the collective knowledge of the American citizen.
It can be very invasive of the privacy of government officials. Aren't you concerned about doing to government officials what you're concerned they may be doing to others?
We live in a world where lots of personal information is traded about us daily. Credit card numbers are financial histories. And so if it's legal to sell it kind of secretly behind us, it feels like it must be legal to share it publicly.
Hey, did you get a grade for this project yet?
I'm trying to graduate with this project.
The Total Information Awareness Program, or TIA. But some folks at MIT thinks that it's not A-okay.
That's right. Just like the internet or cable television, this system requires a mature audience. We have to be aware of who enters the information.
I understand your leeriness about having the government, in this time of terror, look through so many people's information. So you've come up with this new website where you're inviting anybody with fingers and a keyboard to type in and essentially tattle on politicians, right? It just seems like this is a perfect opportunity for somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician who's just simply trying to do their job. Somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician who's just simply trying to do their job. Somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician who's just simply trying to do their job.
I'm looking at this more as a process, as a way to sort of give us a hope of maintaining a democracy as the technologies we're developing are building a very dangerous, asymmetric balance of power.
So, what was fun about this, thanks. What was fun about Ryan's work was, that for one thing, that Fox, I showed mostly the negative stuff, but in fact they were very easy on him for someone who was trying to take down the Bush administration. I think what we've been able to do being at MIT is sort of coat ourselves with sort of like a Vaseline of, because MIT is supposed to be apolitical, that's how people see it, and so we've been able to do this work, and people say, oh, it's just technology, it can't be political, but in fact, it's just as political as Fox News or other major broadcast systems. We did another project in the summer of 2004, which was called TextMob, and it was basically one of the first protest systems developed specifically for phones during the Republican National Convention in Manhattan. We actually shut the city down in parts. The Wall Street Journal started writing about this because the protests were the first really successful protests that had happened since Seattle. And the police were incredibly aware of kind of the tactics that had been used in Seattle, and they've been actually appropriating databases of activists, like going into activists or indie media groups' offices and stealing the hard drives as evidence in advance of things so that people would lose their mailing list. So TAD developed a system where you could create a mailing list with SMS, no special application, just SMS, and join a mailing list. And so people within the protest would not create a mailing list until the right moment. And in fact, if the police, for instance, split up the march, they would create mailing lists for each half of the march, which would both then feed to each other and things like that. So it became so successful that the ambulance drivers and the police ended up logging onto it because it was the fastest way that they could tell what was going on. After about 3 days, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about it, and they called all the phone companies and they said, how are you allowing this? This seems like it's very risky political behavior for a phone company to be engaged in. And the phone companies then started closing down the service, which is crazy because everyone who used it had opted in. So they really didn't have any right to do that, but they could because they're the phone companies. So we thought, okay, we could go to the court and get an injunction, ask the judge to produce the service, but it would cost a lot of money. And anyway, that's not how we roll, right? So instead we asked the hacker community to develop an application which would proxy the messages for us. And within 24 hours, we had a Java applet that people anywhere in the world could bring up on their browser, and it would our server would send the text to their computer, and then their computer would send it to the phone company, and so they were unable to block us from then on. The software got used in a lot of different places. You can see in the Orange Revolution it was used. But moreover, I just learned 2 weeks ago, so I'm going to mention this because it's kind of funny. The Twitter guys had our source code printed out on the walls of their office while they were developing Twitter. I just learned this from one of the developers. But I have yet to see the royalty checks. So I talked about the systemic problems, which is that it's governments and corporations that are empowered to build and distribute most technologies and how that makes them inherently conservative. But we're actually in this beautiful moment where we're seeing for the first time a new kind of labor, a new kind of force that could produce different technologies. This is Yochai Benkler at Harvard's Berkman School, who's done really great work on this. He has a book called The Wealth of Networks, which I would really recommend reading. But his argument is that we're at a moment where it's really not just an ethical, but also a economic imperative to develop free and open software and other kinds of products. And his argument is, if you're in any way unempowered, you should be using these technologies because they build in revolution kind of in their own use. We've been looking a lot at kind of the management studies and the economists who are studying free software. This is the work of Eric von Hippel and Carlos Baldwin at MIT and Harvard. Eric von Hippel points out that until now we had producer innovators who were big companies and things like that. And if something was complicated, Design cost is the bottom axis, so that's complication. Like an airplane, you would really only want to have Airbus or Boeing design an airplane because they're so big and complicated. So until now, it was companies that could make those kinds of things. And then if communication costs were high but design costs were low, like say in a village somewhere, you would have a local person doing innovations around locksmithing or building agricultural implementation. And until now, the producer innovators could only produce things where communication costs were high. But now that communication costs are down in the basement, there's a new kind of open collaboration innovator called free software, and that's making a lot of things possible. It means that you don't have to be designing products for profit. You can be designing them for social movements, for your political affiliation, for your gender affiliation, and anything like that. And it can design very complicated, beautiful, successful devices that are, like Linux and other things. This is open source development for people who have never met each other around the world, collaborating, building files and processes together. So after doing this work, kind of from an artist perspective, for about 8 years, I was given the opportunity to create a new center at MIT called the Center for Future Civic Media, and I'll just show a couple of projects from that. But it kind of extends what we've been doing, but really we've focused on building through this open source free software collaboration method. And one of the things that we are able to do with that is to configure users of technology not as consumers but as citizens in some way. And so we've really been kind of focusing on that as our approach. So for instance, how many of you don't have an electronic device in your pocket right now? Okay, almost no one. Right, so if you have something like this on your body, it uses tin, and 80% of the world's tin, and pretty much 80% of the tin in your device, is mined in Indonesia in open pit mines like this. So you're actually helping continue this labor just by tweeting, right? I see you. You're helping kind of continue this. And so some of my students started saying, it's kind of crazy. We have these companies, they produce all this information, they have all these processes, but none of it's public. So can we start taking the supply chain, the way that products are made, and allow people to collaboratively research and put online that relationship between the communities where things are produced and the communities where they're consumed, so that people can at least understand better the impacts of buying a device like this and maybe hold the corporations more responsible. So using a Wikipedia-like research system where people can contribute new maps, they built SourceMap, which is now, I think, the premier supply chain software that's available. You can share it on websites, you can calculate carbon costs, and we're now starting to work on labor as well. They just did a big trip to India to look at kind of labor issues around clothing and food in India. So check out sourcemap.org if you haven't seen it before. It's quite fun. That thing about corporations producing most of the technology, this is a great example. This is Google Maps, which is incredibly useful. I use it every day. But this is what Lima, Peru looks like at a high zoom level. And I think probably a lot of rural Serbia might look like this as well. And the reason is because in a corporate model, you optimize costs, you do things based on efficiency, not based on utility to a particular community. So these satellites, which cost about $100 million, fly over New York and Paris and all sorts of places like that every day. But they don't fly over Lima, Peru very often, and so you get poor resolution. So one of my students, much like Marco's work earlier, decided that it was important for communities to be able to map themselves and not rely on these big companies to do the mapping. So he kind of ironically decided to create a $100 satellite, one satellite per child. And it looks like this, and it's actually, the cost has come down, but you can just use any disposable camera. And he was working in Lima, and he worked with the kids in the community to get them to map their neighborhood from memory. And so the taqueria and the candy stores were always very, very big. And then he had them build the kind of city they wanted to live in. It looks a little bit like New Belgrade. And then he took them outside, and they got to kind of just fly kites and balloons all day. And what's nice about the maps is that the kids are in every one of the maps because they're always right underneath the camera. And this is what the image looks like. This is Google Maps in the background, and his map stitched below it. About 10,000 times the spatial resolution. and even more so temporal resolution. You can do one of these mapping sessions in a few hours and end up stitching it. This is the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, one of the most polluted sites, and what they were doing is they were mapping it to figure out where the ice was melting, and then they could figure out where companies were dumping chemicals into this industrial river. The resolution is pretty good. You can actually see people's foot treads, in the snow. They've now been modifying the cameras so that, for instance, this is measuring infrared, which is highly correlated on the surface of the Earth to chlorophyll. So you can tell which areas of a particular community are efficiently growing. So obviously the soccer field gets a lot of fertilizer. But this is being now used by urban gardeners to try to figure out where are good places to build gardens in a city. And this is my favorite. They've modified a $30 camera. Just you open it up in about 10 minutes. And can basically put, instead of the lens, you put like a little bit of a CD, a broken CD, and it turns into a spectrogram. And so they can now tell, for instance, there are communities putting up terabytes of data from the Gulf region after the BP oil spill. And now you can tell if it's actually oil or just mud like the BP claims are. Here's another one we've done. This is for Juarez, Mexico, which is in Juarez, and people are very depressed because it's the murder capital of the world. And all the news about Juarez is very bad. And I was with this group of journalists and NGOs, and someone asked them, who are your heroes in Juarez? And the head of the Journalism Association, who lost many of his friends to assassinations, he looked like this and he said, there are no heroes in Juarez, and everyone agreed. And I was there as an outsider, and I was like, wait a minute, to wake up in Juarez, that's heroic. To cross the street, that's like an act of bravery. Like everyone in Juarez is a hero, and so we decided to develop a system called Crónicas de Heroes.mx, which was basically just a way for people to put up little, stories about civic engagement and things that people were doing well. And it's become very popular. I think we're getting close to 1,000 reports have been filed so far. And what's nice too is that it's kind of changed some of the news about what's going on in Juarez. So a lot of press has been focusing on these positive stories. They can be really small, like just someone returns a wallet or things like that. But then this is the most recent project that we did. We just relaunched it about a week ago because, of course, we got into legal trouble, and that took a couple months. But this is a blogging platform for prisoners. 1% of Americans are in jail. We have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. Fuck yeah. And those prisoners are not allowed to use the internet. So Charles Tatar, one of our researchers, decided that he wanted to build a blogging system where prisoners could basically create blogs by writing letters, which they are allowed to do. They send them to us. We build a kind of a volunteer base out of families and friends of prisoners, and they're able to put that information, scan it very quickly online. So these are some of the recent posts, betweenthebars.org. And then what's nice also is that you can transcribe a letter so that it's Google searchable and usable in other ways. And so we had 100% transcription within 24 hours of all the blog posts. We've got about 400 bloggers active right now with almost no promotion. People can leave comments just like on the regular blog, and we then print the letters out and send them back to the prisoners. So this is a chance to kind of help prisoners express themselves, to do their own political efforts towards prison reform, and to have a voice on the internet. Of course, it's very difficult because many of the prisoners went to jail before the internet. So we have to go through a very complicated process of helping inform them, giving them FAQs about what it means to have an online identity. It's entirely in the abstract for them because they can't even see their own blog posts. But it's going very, very well, and some of the stories are pretty amazing, and so is the tattoo art. So I'll just show, I'm just in my time now, so I'm just going to show one more video, but follow back. That's my Twitter handle. Take a look at the Center for Future Civic Media and the Competing Culture Group. So the last piece that I'll show, this is kind of getting back to the artwork. This is Alyssa Wright, and Alyssa was noticing that at the height of the Iraq War, and even today, if you ask the average American how many civilians have died in Iraq, they say something like 9,000 something on average. And there's something in the American psyche that won't go beyond 10,000 because, in fact, the Lancet in 2004, 2005 said it was 500,000 civilians had died in the war of Iraq. And Americans, they've seen that figure, it's been in the news, but somehow they're not able to understand that. And Alyssa Wright, the student, was thinking, this is so strange. Why does major media fail us? So she started looking historically at previous eras of media. And one of the things in the 19th and 18th centuries, there weren't a lot of newspapers, and so when people wanted to put in information out, they would often print their own pamphlets. It was called pamphleteering. Now it's just for like nightclubs. But then it was for news and other things, and if you had a really important story to tell, you could give a pamphlet. So she decided that she wanted to do something about civilian deaths in Iraq. And we were pretty cautious because she also didn't want to be taking advantage as an artist. If she did really well with this artwork, she'd kind of be taking advantage of those deaths. So she wanted to make sure that she wasn't being blasé about the suffering, but wanted to do an art piece about the civilian deaths. So what she did is she took a map of Baghdad and she basically superimposed a map of Boston over it. And she had a computer go every day in Baghdad, which was night in Boston, and find data about who was killed in Baghdad, what their name was, what neighborhood was, and she would map that on Baghdad. And then she would put the overlay of the Boston map on so that she could have an analog. If I live in Boston, but I was really from Baghdad, and someone was killed, this is where it would be in Boston. And so she put this backpack on in the morning, and it has downloaded this data the previous night. It has a GPS and a database and some other stuff. So as she's walking through Boston, it senses, she doesn't know, it senses if she's near a place where a bomb had gone off in Baghdad. And if she gets too close to it, then her backpack will basically produce about 2,000 pamphlets with the names of people who were killed in Baghdad, the civilian casualties. And so she doesn't know when it's going to go off, and neither does the policeman next to her or the guy with a bad heart next to her. So it was a very grueling performance to do as she walked through Boston showing this stuff. But her hope was that for the people around, it would generate, as well as for her, some kind of sense of empathy. Thank you very much.